Mr. Speaker, why is population important? Why is population important, Mr. Speaker? Because it's one that is based on facts that are easily available. The data on population, this country conducts a census every 10 years, so it ensures predictability. Number two is a transparent figure. Is very clearly objective because services are provided on per capita. It's something that you can measure, and it also ensures equality because when you deal with population. Okay. So, Mr. Speaker, it also ensures equal per capita transfers to all the counties. And population, therefore, Mr. Speaker, is a very important parameter. However, Mr. Speaker, when the CRA was collecting this information or collecting views from across the country, and they did consult with all stakeholders, including the public, Mr. Speaker, some of the counties that are highly populated, counties like Nairobi and Kakamega and Kiambu, Bungoma and Meru and so forth, Mr. Speaker, they had recommended that the weight assigned be increased. It's obvious because then the more the weight, the more money they get. But Mr. Speaker, at the same time, nearly 36 of the counties, which is really most of the counties, did not want population to be increased, or factors such had been recommended by some of the counties like population densities to be used and so forth. Mr. Speaker, and the reasons are pretty clear. Some of these counties that we have mentioned are counties that already have good infrastructure. They are counties, Mr. Speaker, in terms of they have potential for more revenue collection locally. Mr. Speaker, and most of them, because of the high density, the populations are concentrated in smaller areas, makes it cheaper to provide services and so forth. So, Mr. Speaker, in view of the, the fact that there is need, therefore, to balance with the needs of all the others, the population factor has been retained. We felt it is necessary to retain the population factor and not to reduce it, Mr. Speaker, to retain it at 45%. The second, which I want to look at, Mr. Speaker, is the one on the basic equal share, Mr. Speaker. The basic equal share. Now, this is also a very important parameter, Mr. Speaker. Now, when funds are transferred, Mr. Speaker, we have to ensure that each of the counties are able to provide certain basic services. There are certain costs that are fixed. For instance, every county has a governor. Every county has an assembly. They have to have county executive. They have to have a minimum level of service provision. They have health facilities. They have which they have taken over and so on. So there is a basic service that has to be provided, and therefore this basic equal share is intended to ensure that every county at least has adequate money to cover those basic services that they must provide for. Mr. Speaker, the thing that has been raised, some members had raised even at the committee level, and I think members of public had raised that a basic equal share does not ensure fairness. You are just giving every county 25% equally, and the counties are not the same. The counties have different needs. There are different levels of development, different challenges. So it's not a measure that ensures fairness. It's not a measure that enhances efficiency because you're just giving everyone, the same amount and so forth. So those are some of the challenges that I think come with that principle, which some also say violates the basic principle of democracy, which is in a democracy you have to the per capita is important, and so it's those issues have been raised. However, I think the overriding factor, the reason why we retained, is that these counties must provide for those basic services. They have an establishment to pay for, they have services to deliver. So that basic minimum will ensure that everyone at least has to come a certain level, and is useful for particularly those counties that have a smaller population nearly, I think, about quite a sizable number actually, and so we retained it at that figure. The third one that I want to look at, Mr. Speaker, the third criteria is on poverty. Mr. Speaker, the poverty gap, which is what is recommended here, is a measure of the depth of poverty, the extent to which the individuals or households fall below the poverty line. Mr. Speaker, the figures on the poverty are based on the Kenya Integrated Household Survey that was conducted by Kenya Bureau of Statistics. Mr. Speaker, based on that, and the figures are provided for in this document by CRA, I think on the last few pages you'll find the actual poverty figures for each of the counties based on the poverty gap. Mr. Speaker, members can look at it. I don't want to go into that detail, but based on that, Mr. Speaker, it's very important because it's not just about poverty, but the extent, the depth, how severe, how much resources, how much funding is required really to help. Because really, at the end of the day, resources are about helping those who are in need, and I think we have to. And the Constitution is very clear also in that regard, the need to ensure that we provide for those resources to those who are in need, and that I think in Article 2 or 3 is very clear on that. So I think we have provided for that. However, we have adjusted that figure a bit downwards to 18 so that we can also allow some other parameters which I'll be addressing shortly, which are essential to some of the counties, Mr. Speaker. So that is the figure provided for poverty, is 18%. Then we have the land area, Mr. Speaker. Land area is also significant for a good number of the counties, Mr. Speaker, for the obvious reason that services that are provided for in some of these counties, which have a large land surface area, is expensive. The cost of delivery of service is expensive. The cost of delivering, if you're picking, moving from Marsabit, for example, where Senator Argura comes from Marsabit town, I know if you have to go to Illoret, it's 600 kilometers. Within one county, 600 kilometers. So the cost of service delivery, really, if there's an ambulance that is picking someone from Illoret to Marsabit, it's not the same as some of the counties that have 200, less than 500, square kilometers. There are counties that are that small. So we are looking at counties which have 75,000 square kilometers, like Turkana, and like his and many others. So land is critical in terms of the cost of delivery of service, Mr. Speaker, because of the large area that needs to be covered. We are not saying that the small areas also don't. That is why in the computation, even the small areas have got concerns about the terrain and so forth. So nearly half, actually more than half of the counties had recommended that the weight on this parameter of land be increased. However, we have agreed with CRA that we retain it at that level of 8%.
Senator
although
Karaba,
more than half of the counties.
Senator Karaba, what is it? Okay. You had pressed by mistake. Okay. Proceed.
Very well.
Proceed, Chair.
Mr. Speaker, then the next, so that is on land. Then the next one, Mr. Speaker, is on fiscal responsibility. Mr. Speaker, fiscal responsibility is important because we need to know how county governments really, it's to look at how county governments address the issues of financial management. So, Mr. Speaker, the fiscal responsibility is a very important parameter which addresses the issue of the prudent financial management. Mr. Speaker, some of the principles on fiscal responsibility are already provided for in the PFM Act, which looks at the level of recurrent expenditures and so forth and so forth. But I think in this particular one, Mr. Speaker, what the formula looks at here in terms of the factor that is being used is very specific. It looks at the county's own revenue. how much revenue, the fiscal revenue that has been collected, the revenue, the county's own revenue as a proportion of the county's total expenditure, Mr. Speaker. So this is important. The idea is to encourage counties to collect more revenue. But Mr. Speaker, because the counties are still new and we are still in a transition phase and we don't have a lot of information and data really on how counties manage, because audits are still not being done, and I think this is an area that we need to develop more intensely, maybe at the next revenue, Mr. Speaker. At present, it's not very easy to look at really how counties, the efficiency in terms of managing their finances and their revenue collections and so forth. So we decided not to put in a lot of weight on this, and we have actually adjusted the weight down to just 1%, and because the revenue collections still form a significantly small amount relative to the total amount of revenue that the counties get from the national government. Mr. Speaker, the two other parameters that have been introduced, one is the development factor, Mr. Speaker, which has a weight of 1%. The development factor, Mr. Speaker, is important because it looks at those parameters, those parameters that will help us to take into account the socioeconomic dimensions really into this matter, Mr. Speaker. And I think this is important because it's one of the challenges that we have in this country, is that the success, because of the inequitable resource allocation over many years. When you look at the economic and development indices in these counties, you'll find there are wide disparities, Mr. Speaker. When you look at infrastructure, when you look at sanitation, when you look at water, electricity connection, all those factors, there's a lot of disparity, Mr. Speaker, because of the skewed allocation of resources in the past. So this factor is based on a number of those indicators that the CRA has looked at. For example, the issues about literacy, the pre-primary school enrollment. They looked at immunization level coverage. They looked at delivery in hospitals, Mr. Speaker. They looked at, and I want to talk about that one also, because my county happens to be one of the ones that has the highest maternal mortality rates in the world, Mr. Speaker. The highest we have a maternal mortality rate, women who die at the time of giving birth, 3,795 for every 100,000 women giving birth. Mr. Speaker, that is crazy, when the average is less than 500 in the country. So it looks at all those things, because of the fact that hospitals are not available and delivery in hospitals therefore is limited. So it looks at the basic sanitation, how many houses have connected to water, how many have got, when you look at the statistics, Mr. Speaker, is at the back of this page. You look at Wajir, where the deputy minority leader comes from, and it says, for example, the percentage not attending pre-primary education is 93%. The percentage of households without access to improved sanitation, they don't even have the normal pit latrines, forget about sewerage system in his county, Wajir town headquarters, is 93%. The percentage of households delivering at home in Wajir, 94.6%. So when you compare that with some other counties, I'll just take an example. Mombasa has, the percentage delivering at home is 26. Percentage without access to improved sanitation is only 18. So because of that, we have developed, CRA has developed a factor that looks at all that, including the kilometers of paved roads and so forth. If you look at the last two, page 41, page 41, will show that figure. So they took all that and created a factor which has a weight of 2%, which we are calling development factor, Mr. Speaker. We are calling it development factor. So it's important that we have this because it helps to redistribute resources to ensure that those other areas that have been left behind can also benefit. Mr. Speaker, the last parameter we are looking at is called personnel emoluments, Mr. Speaker. Personnel emolument is also a very important parameter, Mr. Speaker, for the simple reasons that there are a number of counties that have taken over a large number of staff from the former local authorities, a large number of staff, to the extent that their payroll costs represent a very significant proportion of the total amount of money that they get from the share of their revenue. An example, for example, now, if you take Nairobi, they literally spend over 100% of what they get from the allocation of this share of revenue on salaries. These are figures, the figures on salaries are also provided for. And so their counties, I'll give you an example. For example, Mombasa spends 1.5 billion shillings, Mr. Speaker, on personnel emoluments. Mombasa, you know, you have Cliffy spending $1 billion. And you come to then Nyeri, 1.8 billion. Then you have Kiambu, 2.6 billion of their money goes, you know, and so forth and so forth. Then Nairobi, almost 3.8, nearly 3.8 billion shillings is spent on salaries. So, Mr. Speaker, in order to address that disparity also, I think this factor was recommended by CRA, and we looked at it, and we kind of agreed that it helps to strike a balance, and so we should go ahead and allow 2%. I'll give it a weight of 2%. So that factor is important, so that at least those counties that have a huge establishment of personnel, they do not, you know, have all their money going in. It's not significant, but at least it helps. It helps a bit. So it's a question of the how much is your personnel costs as a percentage of the total. The entire 47 counties spent 47 billion shillings last year, Mr. Speaker, on emoluments. They spent 47 billion. So if Mombasa payroll is 1.5, then it's 1.5 as a percentage of that 47 billion. That is how you get the factor for you can check for each of your counties. That is the basis on which it is done. So I think it's an important because then what it does is it helps those counties. So those are the parameters, Mr. Speaker, and the end result of that is that population will have 45, then the basic share will have 25, then the poverty gap 18, land area 8%, fiscal responsibility 1, development factor 1, and personnel emoluments 2%. Mr. Speaker, I think these are very